To start with, that was a very informative presentation, and I would definitely want to buy the book and read it. However, I had a question about one of the techniques used to study this research. I mean, it was interesting how it said that all the main point of access for the subjects or the samples were educational institutions. Then again, I think a bias comes in here because you are only looking at educated youth from those countries, right? So, and then again, it also matters, I think, it is crucial to look at what kind of educational institutions you are looking at. Are they religiously affiliated? Are they secular? Are they public? Are they private? And it also needs to be taken into account what is the total percentage of educated or average educational level in those particular countries. Because at the end of the day, it brings us down to the question that are all these outcomes, do they actually generally represent the youth of those particular countries?
Thank you. Next.
Thank you very much for the various presentations. So my question is basically why you haven't looked at how youth in countries like Saudi Arabia and Iran perceive their identities, because at the end of the day, Pakistan, Nigeria, and other places that you all looked at have some kind of affiliation to that. For instance, in Nigeria, people that are Sunni look up to, say, Saudi Arabia, and people that are Shia look up to Iran. So it would have been nice to see how the Muslims in those countries perceive their identities compared to those places that you've looked at, and how the political dynamics has the dynamics in these different countries has influence on this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and then we'll come back to the front.
I had a similar concern, and it's a suggestion for your future research, maybe, if you want to take it. Yes, that is, you mentioned strongly that in your findings, many Muslim youth identify with their national identities. And that's there in the study because most of them were living in predominantly Muslim countries, right? But if you were to look at India, which has had such a varying atmosphere and which actually relates directly to the topic. I mean, Muslims who chose to stay back after the partition were, they chose to stay back as an option. And Muslims who live today with all the noise around them, with the narratives around them, it would have been interesting to come to that conclusion or finding or whatever.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
That's on, but my question was, did you survey at all? You talked a lot about gender, but you really talked about it within the binary of male-female. Were there at all other, was the option given to identify as anything else besides male or female? Was that even relevant to this? And the same question sort of goes with sexuality, if that was, that information was sought after, or if it was ignored. It might have been outside of the scope of the study, but even just if it wasn't surveyed, what your inferences on how those results might have been different outside of that gender binary and out of heteronormativity.
Thank you very much for that first round. I think a lot of the questions perhaps focused on a lot more future work. However, perhaps Merit and colleagues, maybe you want to have the first round of responses very quickly, not necessarily to each one of the questions, but maybe some general comments, and we can have a second round.
Hello? Okay, I'm just going to start off. I mean, thanks for all the questions, and they're really important both in terms of methodology and in terms of contextual studies. If we could get funding to do those studies, we would. But we had to start somewhere, and we chose these countries because we've all got experience in these countries, so we had contacts, and we had contacts with youth and different kinds of organisations that would allow us to speak to you. So, very good ideas about which other places we could go to, and obviously we are suggesting that there will be interesting configurations of how youth in those different places understood their national, religious, gender identity, amongst others. For example, ethnicity we didn't talk about much today, but actually in some of the cases this was more pertinent to how youth in different places understood themselves than it was in other places. So, good questions. The methodology question, most of the youth we talked to were actually highly educated. Okay, they were in higher education, not all of them, and in schools. So that is an indicator both of their socioeconomic status and their educational status. But again, where we could, we tried to have a focus group discussions with out of school youth as well. Again, I hate to say it, but we didn't have enough funding and we didn't have enough time. And also, just because it's a beginning study, if you like, we wanted to go to the places where we felt that the way that we were asking questions and being asked such questions would not have been threatening in any way, if you like, that it was something that people could talk about. It's a beginning study. Those questions about how we go further are really important and ones that we would, of course, follow. And that we do talk about the constraints of our methodology in the text as well. But maybe not something we can elaborate here, but later. Okay,
Thank you for the question about the extent that we proved the construction of gender and sexuality. I think it's, in a sense, by conducting our focus groups in a sex-segregated way, we also introduce, we affirm a gender binary ourselves. But I've got to say that the youth narratives reverberated with, in terms of nation, for example, understandings of gender that were strongly heteronormative. And so this came back to us. We didn't probe directly issues of sexuality, but an example from Senegal where heteronormativity came back to us was where in the ideal of a Senegalese national male, a female responded and said, well, if he's not married, not working, and so on, well, frankly, I mean, excuse the word, he's would be seen as a pervert. So it's just assumed that there's a whole set of things bound up with kind of heteronormative relations. So these things came back to us through these in that way. We didn't specifically use the word sexuality at all in our interview schedule.
Wouldn't it have been possible as well to use sexuality, explore their perspectives on sexuality explicitly, particularly in the context of Pakistan? It would have been impossible also to have mixed gender discussion without male dominating the discussion. Just to explain this issue further, it was very difficult to get hold of females even within educational institutions. So tutors would tell us they would spare them within their official classroom time so that they could actually participate as soon as the classes would be off. They were expected to leave and go back home. So these were some of the difficulties and the constraints under which we were working.
I was quite interested in your question about Saudi Arabia and Iran. If you're interested in this, please read the Lebanon chapter, because I discuss that quite extensively. So it's very interesting with the Shia in Lebanon because they are part of the Muslim majority in Lebanon as well as the region, but they're internal others in terms of being a minority sect within the dominant group. So there were a lot of pleas to identity building with Iran and a global and a supranational Shia identities. So I can't, it's very complicated, I can't explain it in a few minutes, but I do hope you check out the Lebanon chapter and it will explain it in depth.
Okay, thank you very much. Mary, we've gone beyond the scheduled time to end, but do you want to still take one more final round? And I don't want to indulge in your time, but I think people will have an opportunity to speak with you during the reception as well. But we'll go for a last round. I see 2 hands here, perhaps the 2 in front and then 2 others. 1 there, 1, 2, 3. Okay, we have 2 here, 3 and 4.
Thank you all. That was really, really interesting. It's Diwali well spent. But so one of your findings, you talked about how in your discussions with the youth, you talked about how it went against the contemporary construction of Islam as antithetical to say constitutional democracy, and yet one could sense that there were these pronounced articulations of nationalistic, patriotic feelings in the conceptualization of their identity. So was there a tension between this national and religious identity of the youth? If you could elaborate on the 2 country context that you missed.
Thank you. I think we have both.
I have 2 quick questions. The first is, when you said troubling, my question is troubling for whom? You do mention that you want to, you're arguing against universalization and homogenization and essentialization of identity to open up that it's a pluralistic, it's diverse, and it's local identities, and it's not in Western theory what modernization is saying, right? The region and modernity are very complex. But then this dominant discourse of homogenizing Muslim identity is very predominant in the Western policies, Western media. But those young people across 4 contexts, or the context that I come from, where world's largest concentration Muslim exists, that awareness of the diversity, that locally different realities, that pluralization is already there. So my question is probably this troubling is mainly you're talking to a Western audience here. The second thing is religification of Muslims. Now, this debate, since 2011 until now, even like 2 weeks ago, this article came out in an Oxford Education Review, religification of Muslims, where no Muslims is just Muslim, right? And the whole idea of religifying the whole identity Muslim as something to do with religion, because there are Muslims who may call themselves Muslim, but it may be part of their history. Is there a cultural identity? Is there a family sense of belonging? So it's not religion. Muslim doesn't necessarily has to cast into religion, you know. So when you say religion was very important part of their identity, did you come across those contested discourses among young people where say, yes, I'm Muslim, but not necessarily in the sense of religion? It could be in the sense of cultural identity. So did you explore those dimensions?
I think since we've had 2 in front, we'll move to the back. Yeah, sorry. There's 1 there and maybe 1 more. Okay.
A question and a comment as well. Your presentation reminded me on a book of Popov and the Iranian Revolution, which written in 20th century, and lots of criticism on how the way Western go and use these post-structuralist views to analyze the Eastern context, and the idea of the ways in which we need to find the ways that can help us to get through the complexities of the cultural background of those countries. Now, because someone else also mentioned about the Iranian context, what I wanted to say was that yes, it was very fascinating the way you depicted how these Muslim youth see themselves. But for me, the more challenging question, which has never been addressed, to my knowledge, at least in the country which I'm researching, which is Iran, is that why is that happening? So it's not only the matter of how they see themselves or how identity, whether it's gender or religious identity, is being practiced. The bigger question is that why do they see themselves that way? What are the causes? If we go deeper in to see what the background of that is, that now as the outcome of that, we can see these people in which they perceive themselves. And that's one thing that I think should be addressed in future research. And one more important thing, sorry, just the final thing. One more important thing is about the individual agency. That's also another thing. What about the individual, the role of individual agency in the way people practice identity?
Thank you. I think since we will give 2 more questions and then you can choose to respond or not. At least we have some ideas on the table. We have one there, one there. Okay.
My name is Bree, and first of all, I'd like to congratulate the panel and the authors. This is an incredibly informative book, because I'm speaking from a practitioner, a human rights practitioner. Probably my relevance in relation to asking this specific query or question is, I have walked in 2 different settings in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where Muslim youth were voiceless and were in minority. In a post-conflict setting, such as Northern Rakhine State, where I worked last year, I'm wondering in the context of this, how applicable all this relevance is in a post-colonial setting when it's actually a minority youth environment. And I guess finally, the question of gender for me is a very important component, especially when I'm actually working in the area of human rights. And that whether it's focal group discussions or whether it's across any sector of my investigation and experience, I've never ever found a scenario with any focal group discussion that there's an equilibrium balance between girls and boys. The representation is predominantly boys. And I'm wondering, in the context of this research, while the research was done over educational status of youth, what was the ratio there in relation to boys and girls? Thank you.
Thank you. I think final question on the set.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the brilliant presentation, compelling presentation, and the kind of wonderful event, really, and the way that this discussion is generated. I think this is deeply distinctive and it's fantastic. My question is a simple one, or not. Is there any? What is the significance of the fact that the local accounts in the local languages were rendered, I'm assuming in English, because you're all speaking English, for the purposes of analysis, if anything?
I think, thank you, we've had quite a range of some connected questions but disparate. And I think, as Meredith has pointed out earlier, is that the book explores a few starting ideas, and it's part of a longer-term project depending on funding and a number of issues. And a lot of the questions, I think, raise both questions directly about the current work, but also presuppose future questions. So I'll let you have the final word.
Okay, just in response, sorry, I can't see anything up here. Just in response to the person there who was sort of unpacking religion, I totally agree with you. And actually in the Shia study in Lebanon, several youth said, you know, I'm Shia, I'm a proud Shia, I identify as a Shia in terms of ethnic affiliation, community membership, but they said I'm a communist. I don't believe in God or whatever. So yes, I completely agree with you. And that's also in the study. And in reference to our friend from Iran here, also part of the study that I conducted does look at how Shia, the Shia in Lebanon come to identify as Shia, why they feel proud as Shia, how Shia are differentiated from others in Lebanon in relation to political events, social events, and so forth. So please read it. I hope it satisfies your curiosity.
Adding to that, in each chapter we do so it's not that we don't link what the youth are telling us to the structures or the causes, as you put it. So, for example, in the case of Pakistan, the historical conflict with India, but also contemporary conflict in neighboring Afghanistan that has destabilized Pakistan as well, were very pronounced in the way youth were articulating their identities and differentiating themselves from external others. Also, their Pakhtun ethnicity. So in the case of Pakistan, Gunjan asked, were there any tensions? We have named the chapter as Converging Imaginaries, because in this particular context where the youth were predominantly Pakhtuns, Muslims, their national identification, their ethnic identification, and their religious identification strongly overlapped and produced a very homogenized understanding where people who, even in the case of Pakistan, one openly said, I do not believe in religion, I do not believe in nation, or everybody is proud of their nation. There's nothing distinctive about Pakistan, but with that one exception, it was very hard for people to publicly distance themselves from these very dominant identity positions.
Yes, I mean, just a couple of comments. We don't just have a Western audience. Remember, we have people online who are, I think, in 3 different continents. So I just want to say hello to them. In terms of the troubling, I think I tried to say when I talked about youth's religious and national identities, how troubled youth were. The youth were themselves about the ways they find themselves represented in the West. So in taking up this troubling, we also found our youth troubled. I think we're, I don't, I want to kind of resist the accusations of speaking only from the West to the West, absolutely. And I would, I suppose, just also want to point out that we are drawing not only on post-structural theories, but very much on post-colonial theories to, again, take up the othering that happens to trouble the dominant discourses of the global north.
Well, I could say lots of things. I could mention something about the language, but I think you all know where to find me. You can persecute me or interrogate me and the team later. Most immediately, we are welcoming you to the wine reception outside. But first, you've got to do your homework, which is to fill in the sheet of audience participation, hand it to somebody. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much, Jordan. Good to see you outside.